The town of Dry Creek was no place for mercy. The desert had a way of drying out a man, just as it did the wells and the bones of cattle left too long in the sun. Yet, on a late afternoon in July, when the shadows grew long and the cicadas began their mournful song, mercy came rattling down the main street in the shape of a black-draped widow and her 5 hungry sons. The wagon was little more than a skeleton of wood and iron, held together by faith and habit. Its wheels groaned as if each turn might be their last. Perched atop it sat a woman whose shawl caught the red light of sundown, her face drawn, her eyes fixed forward. Behind her, 5 boys clung to the boards, their cheeks hollow, their hair tangled by the desert wind. She did not need to announce her story. Anyone with eyes could read it. A husband buried too young. Miles of road behind her, dust in her lungs, and the echo of debts she could not pay. From the boardwalk outside the saloon, men turned their heads. From the porch of the general store, women whispered behind hands. Children paused their games of marbles and followed the wagon with wide eyes until it came to rest before the store. Sheriff Caleb Rourke watched from his office window, arms folded across his chest. He had seen strangers roll into Dry Creek before, drifters with whiskey on their breath, outlaws with false smiles, peddlers with hollow promises. But this was different. This was a woman with 5 boys who looked at the town like it might spit them out before it ever let them in. Evelyn Blackthorne stepped down, her boots hitting the ground with a weight that came not from leather but from weariness. She gathered her shawl close around her shoulders. Her eldest, Samuel, tall for 14, followed her with a guarded glare, placing himself between his mother and the world. Jesse, 11, sharp-eyed and restless, clutched the wagon rail as if calculating escape routes. Luke, tender at 9, held Jacob's small hand. Thomas, 7, fiery and stubborn, jumped down last, scowling at anyone who dared stare. The bell above the general store door jingled as Evelyn entered, the boys trailing behind like shadows. Inside, the air smelled of flour, tobacco, and judgment. "Afternoon, ma'am," drawled Mr. Keller, the storekeep, already eyeing her black dress and the children fanning out across his narrow aisles. "What'll it be?" "Flour. Beans. Soap, if you've got it," she said. Her voice steadied though her hands trembled where she gripped the counter. He bagged the items slowly, watching her. "That'll be $1.70. She lowered her eyes. "I have no coin. Not yet, but I can work. My boys, too, will pay honest." A silence hung in the air thick as molasses. Behind her, the younger children shifted. Samuel's jaw tightened, his hand brushing against his brother's shoulder to keep him still. Mr. Keller cleared his throat. "Work don't pay for food up front. I run a business, not a charity." His words were not cruel, merely final. Whispers rose among the women gathered near the fabric bolts. 5 mouths. Poor soul. Cursed woman, bringing more trouble. Mark my words, she'll lean on the lawman next. Evelyn gathered her shawl tighter. Her pride would not let her beg. "Come along, boys." They shuffled out, their hunger trailing behind them like a ghost. The sack of food sat heavy on the counter, untouched. From his office, Sheriff Rourke had seen enough. He pushed open his door, boots sounding on the boardwalk, his badge catching a flare of dying sunlight. He was a broad man, not loud nor quick, but steady as the mesa that loomed beyond town. His gray eyes followed the widow as she mounted her wagon once more. Crossing to Keller's store, he leaned against the post. "Put that flour and beans on my account." Keller frowned. "Sheriff, you ain't obligated." "I said put it down," Caleb answered, voice quiet but immovable. He laid 2 silver pieces on the counter, then walked out before more words could gather. By the time he reached the edge of town, the wagon was creaking away, heading toward the abandoned shack at the far ridge, the only place outsiders dared claim. He followed at a distance, not wishing to shame her further. That night, when the sun slipped behind the horizon and the desert cooled, Evelyn's shack sat in shadow. Inside, the boys huddled around a thin fire, chewing what little bread they had left. Outside, footsteps crunched in the dust. Samuel rose, slipping out with a stick clenched like a weapon. He froze when he saw the sheriff laying down a neat stack of split firewood by the door. Caleb met the boy's eyes, neither speaking. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked back into the night. Evelyn had seen, though she did not step outside. Pride pressed against her chest. Pride and something else she dared not name. She sat back down by the fire, staring into the flames, her hands shaking as if she'd been struck. Her youngest, Jacob, leaned against her shoulder, murmuring half-dream words as he drifted to sleep. His small belly growled even in slumber. And across town, in his own quarters, Sheriff Rourke sat before an empty plate, listening to the silence. He reached for the Bible on his shelf, but did not open it, only laid his hand across its worn leather as if for comfort. 2 souls, both weary. 2 homes filled with hunger of different kinds. Neither spoke it aloud, but the desert night knew. Something had shifted in Dry Creek, quiet as a prayer whispered into dust. The first pale light of morning spilled across Dry Creek, soft as a hymn. It caught the dust in the air, the sagging porches, the stray dog nosing through an alley for scraps. Out at the ridge, where the widow's shack crouched against the barren earth, Evelyn Blackthorne bent over the well, hauling a bucket hand over hand. Her boys clustered around her like restless birds. The rope burned her palms, but she kept her face calm. Sheriff Rourke watched from the road on his way to the office. He did not call out, nor offer to help. He only paused long enough to notice the blistered skin at her knuckles, the frayed edge of her shawl, and the way her youngest clung to her skirts as if afraid the world might steal her away. He rode on, though the image sat heavy in his chest. Life in Dry Creek was never kind to strangers, but life for a widow with 5 sons was near impossible. The town gave her no work. Men muttered about unpaid debts. Women whispered that misfortune clung to her like smoke. Each day she made do with less, stretching meals thin, sewing old cloth into new shapes, turning shame into silence. Yet mercy, once sown, finds root in unexpected soil. Sheriff Caleb Rourke began with small gestures. He brought her a torn shirt, gruffly asking, "Can you mend this? I'll pay you fair." She stiffened, but agreed and stitched it clean. He slipped a coin into Samuel's hand for polishing his boots, another for Jesse when the boy carried messages between the jailhouse and the telegraph. To Evelyn he said little, but he left small proofs behind, a sack of beans marked confiscated from smugglers, though no smugglers had passed through that week, a loaf of bread, always claimed as overstock. At first, Evelyn tried to refuse. Pride was the last coin she had left, and she held it tightly. But her children had no such armor. Samuel learned to stretch $1 farther than most men, and though he glared at the sheriff, he pocketed the coins. Luke, tender-hearted, took to showing Caleb little drawings scratched in the dirt with a stick. Thomas, wild and hot-blooded, brought him feathers or stones, as if daring the sheriff to find them worthy. And Jacob, the youngest, made no distinctions at all. He once toddled up and tugged at the lawman's coat, lisping, "Mr. Pa," before Evelyn snatched him back, her cheeks aflame. Caleb said nothing of it. He only crouched, tipping his hat to the child with a faint smile that lingered after he rode away. The town noticed. The town always noticed. On Sundays, as Evelyn sat in the back pew with her sons pressed against her like a living shield, whispers floated from the rows ahead. The sheriff's keeping her fed. 5 bastards eating off the law. She'll ruin him sure, as she ruined her husband. Evelyn's face burned beneath her shawl. That afternoon she nearly refused further help, near enough to slam her door when the sheriff arrived with a bag of grain. But her boy's eyes, wide and hopeful, stayed her hand. She took the sack in silence, shoulders trembling, pride and hunger warring inside her chest. Later that evening, Caleb found her behind the shack, scrubbing clothes in the wash tub until her knuckles bled. He leaned against the fence, voice low. "Let them talk. They always do." She froze, her breath sharp, water dripping from her raw hands. For a long moment she did not answer. Then she said in a voice nearly broken, "You don't know what it is to be pitted like a beggar." Caleb's gaze held hers, steady, not pitying. "I know what it is to be judged before you open your mouth. That's worse." Something unspoken passed between them then. 2 people who knew shame not as strangers, but as kin. The days stretched on, stitched together by small acts. Caleb began to linger, not in her house but near it, helping mend the broken fence so her chickens would not scatter, setting his coat across the post when the wind grew sharp. Evelyn worked beside him, her movement stiff at first, then softening. Once, as they lifted a plank together, her hand brushed his. It was nothing, a splinter, a scrape, the simple press of skin against skin. But she felt like a spark, and so did he. Neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not hollow. That night, after her boys had tumbled asleep, Evelyn sat by the fire staring at her hands. They bore lines of labor, cuts from wood, burns from cooking over flame. But beneath them lingered the warmth of a moment's accidental touch, and she found herself trembling at the memory. Unseen, Samuel had watched him from the shadows earlier. Suspicion etched deep into his young face. He did not trust the sheriff. He did not trust any man stepping into his father's place. Yet even he could not deny that food had filled their stomachs, would warm their nights, and something steadier than luck had kept them standing. Still, his heart war with itself, resentful, grateful, afraid. The slow bond grew not in words, but in the space left unsaid, in the brush of hands against splintered wood, in the way Caleb tipped his hat to Evelyn's boys, as though they were men already, not ragged children, in the way Evelyn, proud even in ruin, began to stand straighter, her eyes meeting his more often than before. Out on the ridge, the shack still sagged. The wind still howled across the desert. Hunger still crouched close. But in that fragile space where two weary souls crossed paths, something else began to grow. Not love, not yet, only the quiet stirrings of it, the seed buried deep in hard soil, waiting for its season. And Dry Creek, blind with its gossip, had no notion that one day soon, the bond forming in silence would face its first true test. The desert gives no warnings when storms are coming. Sometimes it's only a hush, a stillness in the air that sets dogs barking and rattles loose shingles on rooftops. That was how it felt the morning Clint Maddox rode into Dry Creek, with 6 armed riders at his back. Dust rose around them like smoke from a fire. Maddox was a cattle baron, broad in chest, heavy in drink, and cruel enough to make both men and women cross the street when he passed. His voice carried like gravel dragged across stone, and his eyes were the pale yellow of a hawk's, hungry, restless. He swung down from his horse in front of the sheriff's office, spurs jangling. "Rourke," he barked, loud enough to draw half the town into doorways. "You're protecting a woman who don't own the dirt she sleeps on. Her dead husband owed me near $50. Dead don't die just 'cause a man does." Inside her shack at the edge of town, Evelyn had already felt the tremor of something coming. Her boys huddled close, Samuel clutching the old rifle that hadn't fired straight in years. By the time she reached town, Maddox had already set his terms in front of the gathered crowd. "She pays me or she's out," Maddox sneered. "And if she ain't got money, then her brats can work it off in my fields. Strong backs, young bones, they'll do." The words fell like blows. Evelyn's face blanched, but her back stayed straight. She stepped forward, her sons circling her skirts like frightened calves. "No," she said simply, though her voice trembled. Maddox's men laughed. One shoved Samuel, who stumbled and fell, the rifle clattering from his hands. Rage flushed his face. He leapt to his feet, ready to strike, but the man raised a whip to crack across his back. The sound never landed. Sheriff Caleb Rourke had stepped between them, his hand closed hard around the whip's handle, his stance unshaken. His gray eyes burned like steel pulled from the forge. "You'll do no such thing," he said quietly. Maddox smirked. "You gonna stop me, lawman? You got a badge, but I got 6 men and every right to claim what's owed." Caleb's voice was steady as a sermon. "Debt died with the man. These children don't pay for their father's sins. Not while I wear the star." The square grew silent. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. Maddox spat in the dirt, then gestured to his men. "Teach him what happens when he stands in the way." The first blow came fast. A fist caught Caleb across the jaw, snapping his head back. He staggered but did not fall. Another man swung at him, but Caleb ducked, driving his own fist into the outlaw's ribs. The crowd gasped, women clutching their children as the fight broke loose in a fury of dust and curses. Caleb fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. He did not draw his gun, only his fists, his boots, his sheer will. Blood spattered from his lip, his knuckles split. But each time he was struck, he rose again, eyes unyielding. At last, he caught Maddox's right-hand brute with a blow, so hard a man crumpled into the dust. Caleb straightened, chest heaving, blood dripping from his chin. His gun still rested at his hip, untouched. He turned, voice carrying through the hushed square. These boys have protector now. Anyone lays hand on them answers to me. For a long moment, Maddox studied him, fury twisting his face. Then, with a curse, he spat again and swung on to his horse. You'll regret this, Rourke, he growled, before riding out in a storm of dust. His men followed, leaving the square in breathless silence. Evelyn stood frozen, her sons pressed close, her eyes fixed on Caleb. He swayed slightly, blood seeping into his collar. Yet he held himself upright, his gaze steady on her. Not the crowd, not the whispers, only her. That night, when the town quieted and the dust settled, Evelyn came to the sheriff's door. He was washing blood from his hands in a basin, his shirt torn at the sleeve. She stepped inside, her shawl drawn tight, her face pale. For a moment neither spoke. Then the dam within her broke. I can't, she whispered, voice shaking. I can't hold it all anymore. The debts, the boys, the shame, it's too heavy. Caleb set down the rag, turned and knelt before her, not as sheriff, not as lawman, but as a man stripped bare. He removed his hat and laid it in her hands like an oath. He said nothing, because words would have been too small. Behind her skirts, little Jacob toddled forward, his eyes bright with sleep. He climbed into Caleb's lap without hesitation, tiny arms wrapping around the sheriff's neck. In a voice soft as candle smoke, he whispered, Pa. The world seemed to stop. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest, shame and longing colliding in a single gasp. Tears filled her eyes. Caleb closed his bloodied hand resting gently on the boy's back. He did not correct him. He only held him tighter. And for the first time since her husband's death, Evelyn let her shoulders sink, not from defeat, but from release.